Under construction. "Ho, halt there!" the officer shouted. He held his hands out to John like two makeshift stop signs. John pulled his Chevy to the side of the road, his snow tires crunching softly over the scattered gravel. The police officer started toward John, waving for him to roll down his window. He did so, and the man bent down to John's height, his face masked by a set of comically large black sunglasses. The policeman was balding, his black, stringy hair sticking up in untidy spikes. His pudgy cheeks were rosy from the cool temperature outside, and his double chin rolled past his thick neck like a sagging sack. The cop leaned in through the window, his fat gut pressing against the door. His face was inches from John's nose, and he was able to watch his uncomfortable reflection swim crazily in the sunglasses. The cop panted heavily.
"This way is closed for constriction, sir."
John blinked slowly, his head edging into the headrest of the seat as the man leaned even closer. "What? Castle Lake is closed?" John asked. Castle Lake Road was a steep mountain pass winding up the side of Black's Peak. From the overhanging cliff, inches from the right side of the road, a stunning view of the entire Rocky Mountains was clear. Forests of plush spruces and aspens speckled the sloping foothills and mountains like pepper. That day, John was headed up to Ray's Park to meet his buddy for a weekend of camping and hunting. Yet Castle Lake was suddenly closed, the only road up to Ray's Park. "Yes, sir, can't you see the constriction tape up there?" the cop asked. He pointed at the neon tape roping off the road. Beyond the tape, there were two workers staring at him, hammers and drills in hand. They were holding the tools when there seemed to be no real construction in effect. "What happened to the road?" John asked. "Joust some light reconstriction, sir." "I get that, but, sir, you're gonna have to turn around and go back," he added, starting to step away. "Listen, officer, I really need to get to Ray's Park by 7, so could you please let me slip by?" John asked. His face was scrunched up to show remorse. "I have some company waiting for me up there." "Absolutely not. The road is torn up," the cop snapped. John looked back at the road and saw that it was smooth as ever. "But nothing is really—" "Sir, turn around. This isn't the way you're going." The cop turned from John's car and strode away toward the construction site. As he walked back, John noticed something odd about the cop's uniform he hadn't studied before. He realized it wasn't a police uniform at all, and he did a quick double take. The man's uniform pants were now acid-washed jeans, and he wore a faded gray undershirt. His feet were clad in rubber snow boots instead of polished dress shoes. The cop's belt, which was only a leather strap to a purse, was tied with a sloppy knot. Hanging from the leather strap was an airsoft gun, he could tell from its colored tip. "Officer?" John asked through the window. The man turned like a top and John gasped. He wore a gray police uniform with iron dress pants and polished black shoes. Around his waist wasn't a leather strap after all. It was a black regulation belt with pouches and holsters. John slumped in his seat, his thoughts spinning in confused revolutions. Had he really seen that fake uniform moments ago? What was happening? "Go back, sir," the man said. John gasped again, his jaw hanging open in awe. The oversized sunglasses that had been on the man's face were now gone, revealing beady eyes, one green and one blue. Moments ago, the man had been balding excessively, but now long bangs fell over his dirty forehead. His double chin was gone as well, but he still panted, his large gut convulsing. In stunned silence, John turned his car around and took off the way he'd come. Through the rear-view mirror, he saw that the cop and construction workers were watching him go. The sunglasses were again perched on the obese man's nose. Then the construction site blinked out behind a hanging rock cliff. John was almost to the fork that would link Castle Lake and Federal when his cell phone rang. John put it to his ear as he drove, and Eddie spoke softly from the receiver. "Almost to Ray's?" his friend asked. "No, the road's roped off for construction," John explained. "I couldn't get through." "The road was roped off?" "It wasn't when I went by some 10 minutes ago," Eddie replied. "They couldn't have gotten construction going in that amount of time." John hit the brakes and the car skidded to a stop on the deserted road. "You barely passed Castle Lake by the time I got there," John proclaimed. "Yeah, the line cut out and the phone flashed to indicate the loss of service." John set the phone aside and turned the car around a second time. No construction had started in the last 10 minutes, John knew for sure. 10 minutes later, John rounded the last bend and spotted the caution tape, fluttering in the breeze. But this time no one was around. The three men were gone. He was just about to speed up dramatically and fly right through the construction tape when a figure emerged out of nowhere. It was as if it had just liquefied from the rock overhang. John stomped on the brakes and halted in the street. The figure came into focus, walking carefully into the middle of the road. It was a cop again, but a different one. This man wasn't as fat as the other. He had the same gray uniform and the balding head, but it was blonde. Those same absurd sunglasses were propped on a sharp nose set above a chiseled jaw. "Sir, I believe I told you to head back the way you came." John stuck his head out the open window and noticed how, when he spoke, his breath plumed out before him in a cloud. The cops did not. "I don't think I've talked to you before, officer." "We just talked, sir." Then realization crept over his face and it started to change. The chiseled jaw sagged and the double chin rolled over his fat neck. The cheeks blew out like balloons and the rosy color animated his face. His hair started to grow out over his forehead, creating bangs, and then faded from blonde to black. The cop swiftly whipped off his shades to reveal two different colored eyes. His horrible accent had returned as well. "We did talk, sat," the man said. "Holy Christ!" John barked, punching down on the gas. He went to swerve around, and the cop responded by drawing his revolver like a ready gunslinger. John cried out, ducking his head as the car closed the distance. The policeman fired his weapon, but what discharge was nothing more than an orange airsoft pellet. It bounced off the windshield without harm. John tore through the tape. Through the rearview mirror, he saw that the man was wearing a gray dress shirt and acid-washed jeans. He wore a familiar pair of snow boots with the makeshift leather strap around his waist. There was a glint of reflecting light, and John realized that the sheriff's badge on his left breast was only a crumpled wedge of tinfoil. John continued along the untouched street, his heart racing, his shirt drenched in sweat. The eyes were the only features that had never changed on the man, those piercing, multicolored eyes. The sun was quickly blotted out by the overhanging clouds, leaving the world gray and dull. The cliff walls on the left-hand side started to pulse outward, as if they were rubber. The road had lost its color just like the sky, going from black tar to a faded gray. The outside world began to blur, all its beautiful colors blending into a monotonous blot. His wheel felt like it was drooping through his fingers like wet clay, and his seat was starting to sink through the floor of the car. He never blinked, the road ahead shining with a pleasurable intensity. He was mesmerized by it, hypnotized by its glory. The mountain pass was now a bright, glowing strip in a sea of gray. The trees around him became angry faces that screamed and reached out at the car with brown fingers. They scraped across the windshield, leaving deep grooves in the glass. John screeched, stomping harder on the accelerator. He was speeding close to 80 miles per hour, but he didn't even notice. In the distance, standing out from the ongoing gray, was an orange sun complete with revolving black moons. This wasn't the Earth's sun. It was a sun from another galaxy. It was as if part of John's world had rubbed off like a smeared fingerprint, and another fingerprint, an alien print, had pressed over it. There was an explosive report that tore through the air. John hit the brakes and the car skidded. At that instant, a silver dish the length and width of two semi-trucks sped by overhead. It passed over John's car, leaving an ear-shattering boom in its wake. John's windshield cracked and blew in from the roar. His eardrums popped and blood squirted down his shoulders and back. The car bucked and rolled onto its side. Steam and fire licked out from the exposed engine as the car came to rest upside down. John fell against his seatbelt, his wrist snapping under the restraining strap. His hair brushed the roof of the cabin, his own cries going unheard. The seatbelt snapped and John fell on his neck. He was sobbing and choking gasps as he crawled out through the shattered windshield. All he could hear was a piercing ring. He tumbled onto the landing strip, which was no longer asphalt, but cold glass. Bits of the windshield dug into his side as he crawled away from the wreckage, and he managed to get back onto his feet, his ankle crying out in pain. His wrist hung loosely by strings of flesh and muscle, his bone exposed through the flow of red. He couldn't move any of the fingers. He looked around him and saw that the cliffs were still present, but black as ash. The trees were scarlet red, their faces frowning solemnly down on him. Their twig fingers reached out, grasping at thin air. John turned to see that the mammoth spacecraft was parked on the runway. A compartment was opening, and a large figure appeared in the doorway. 2 orange eyes stared out at him. John turned, limping away from the wreck. Some 20 yards away, parked askew on the landing strip, was Eddie's Jeep. Inside the car stood a cop dressed in a regulation gray uniform. His face was smooth, no nose, mouth, hair, or ears. There were only 2 staring eyes, one green and one blue. Its face was milky white, and it had no fingers or toes. Its limbs ended in claw-like feet and hands that resembled the blades of a shovel. Its uniform suddenly changed back to the familiar dress shirt and jeans. The airsoft gun hung loosely from its hip, most likely a relic from an unattended garage sale. Then the white creature started to stride forward, claw-like feet patting the runway. Beside this creature came 2 more, only they were naked, their skinny frames exposing jutting ribs and pelvises. All of them had multicolored eyes. Suddenly the gray sky faded and thinned, the alien world gone. The Rocky Mountains swam back into view, and the blue sky appeared soon after, a colossal dome. John looked to the jeep and limped after it. Behind him he felt the lumbering footsteps of the creatures from the ship with the orange eyes. It was getting closer each second. But John couldn't look back. It was different from the others, John was certain. It didn't have multicolored eyes, and it was a lot larger. They had been waiting for it to arrive, and now that they were reunited, there was sure to be a plan of action. John sprinted to the side of Eddie's Jeep and fumbled inside, while the 3 white creatures ran at the vehicle. The keys were there in the ignition, the motor still rumbling with life. One of the creatures struck the door, rebounding off it, and yanking at it desperately. John quickly locked the door and spit a mouthful of blood on the window. The monster's eyes shone angrily from the outside, its claw striking the glass. The other monsters were climbing onto the hood of the Jeep, and one white arm burst through the windshield with brutal force. John stamped on the gas, and the white aliens rolled over the windshield in black, bloody streaks, striking the pavement on the other end. The alien dressed in the snow boots and jeans hung on to the driver's door like a spider. It crawled across the side of the speeding car and then found its place atop the hood. One of its claws scoped through the large crack in the windshield. John stepped abruptly on the brake, and the creature propelled off the hood and onto the street with a smack. It got up quickly, its eyes blaring with fury as John accelerated. The creature's back snapped and its head collided with the hood, splattering like a melon. Black congealed blood splashed the glass. The lifeless creature rolled over the roof of the Jeep, joining its dead friends. John reached the other end of the construction site, the bordering tape flapping helplessly in 2 pieces on the asphalt. Then a shadow bathed John's vision like a tinted screen. The silver dish was hovering above him, blotting out the sun. He followed the craft with his eyes as it started to descend. John stared off into the sloping landscape of the Rocky Mountains, past the road and its jutting cliff, past the rolling foothills and brightly lit aspen trees of orange and yellow. Clouds swirled and twisted above the snow-covered peaks like reaching fingers. It was a masterpiece, a sheer, uplifting view. He wanted that to be the last thing he saw on Earth. The silver dish came to a stop in the middle of the road, but John never slowed. He never looked at the street or the ship again, only at his breathtaking view. The Jeep plowed into the craft with a deafening crunch. The monstrous frame blew outward, its galactic shrapnel raining down on the trees and road with metal flakes of hail. Silence returned to thicken the air as fire enveloped a clear Colorado sky.